Good evening. Tonight I am joined by the Grim Reader as we share 3 true scary stories about camping which were submitted by subscribers to this channel. After listening to this half of the collaboration, please make sure to visit the Grim Reader's channel to see the second half of our collaboration of scary stories. If you're not already subscribed to the Grim Reader, please make sure to subscribe when you get there. Enjoy. Number 1. Footfalls. I am a big camping fan, and I don't just mean camping out in some public camping place an hour's hike from a parking lot. When I go camping, I go out camping deep into the woods and generally in the mountains. I generally would go deep into the Appalachian Mountains and get lost for a very long time. Well, not exactly lost. Or at least usually not lost. I'm a pretty good and experienced hiker and camper, so I can generally find my way around pretty good. I don't set up camp in one place either. I tend to hike all day and camp all night in various areas. The scariest thing that ever happened to me while hiking happened to me about 15 years ago. I had 2 weeks off work, and I had planned on being out in the mountains the entire time. Now, I had to keep my car parked in town and then hitchhike out up into the hills in order to get out into the woods and get hiking. Whether I had any legal right to be hiking in that area is up for debate, I suppose. But I got a ride from an old man in a pickup truck, and we drove up the mountain. He dropped me off at least an hour past the last store or gas station that we saw, wished me luck, and I was on my way. It's important to know how often I do this because you really can't go out hiking in the mountains without having a bit of courage. You spend the entire time alone, and a lot of it is in the dark. Even when it is not very dark outside, when the woods get very thick, it can also get very intimidating. The slightest sound can startle you. And when you're so far away from civilization, the sounds and noises of everyday life are gone, and these slight sounds really can be amplified. They can also play tricks on your mind. I didn't have a problem for the most part on this trip though. It wasn't until about the 4th night that, while I was sleeping, I got woken up by a noise that I had heard outside of my tent. There were a lot of leaves on the ground, and I could have sworn that I heard the leaves rustling, as if someone had been walking through them. Rather than get up and turn on my flashlight, however, I just laid in my sleeping bag and tried to listen to what was going on. It really sounded like footfalls. I kept a knife with me in my tent, so I had it with me in case something happened. But I listened, and it didn't sound like the footfalls had come any closer to my tent. But I kept hearing them for a while, until they faded away, and I was eventually able to go back to sleep. The following day, there was no indication that anything had happened. I didn't hear anybody around, and I didn't see anybody around as I was hiking. Everything seemed fine, and I realized that it could have been an animal. This was only a small comfort, however, as it was quite possible that it could have been a dangerous animal. But that was all the previous night, and during the day after, I didn't have any problems. The following night, however, after I was asleep in my tent, I was once again woken up by a similar noise. It was unnerving how similar it was to the night before. It sounded like someone had been walking around in the leaves outside of the tent, but still keeping their distance from me. It carried on for about an hour while I pretended to still be asleep. Then it faded away and I drifted off. The day after the second night was pretty much like the previous day. There was nothing to indicate in any way that anyone had been anywhere close to my tent. I was still a bit freaked out at that point though. I found that even as I was hiking through the woods that I was very nervous and had to try my very best to remain calm. However, the slightest noises were still making me very, very jumpy. That night, I had a third occurrence of the noises outside of my tent. This time, it was a lot different though. I mean, I was still woken up by the sound of what seemed like footsteps in the leaves. But this time, it came close. And I froze and gripped my knife in my hand. I heard the footfalls coming closer and closer. They came close, but never once came right up on my tent. But they were outside, and I could hear them crunching the leaves. I had no doubt that they were the footfalls of another person, and that they were watching me or something. Eventually, however, they walked away. I was awake long after they were gone. I'm sure it had to be hours again before I finally fell asleep once more. But it was a very rough and broken sleep, and I was on edge the entire time. When I finally decided to get up and get out of my tent in the morning, I had decided by that point that it was in my best interest to hike back and get off of this mountain as soon as possible. That decision was confirmed as I emerged from my tent and saw a small piece of what looked like poster board tacked to a tree facing my tent, with the words written on it, "We know you're not sleeping. Leave in the morning." Every word told me so much. We. There was more than one of them. No, you're not sleeping. They knew I was awake. And they obviously wanted me gone. Of course, not to mention the implication of what they might do if I didn't leave. So I packed up and headed the other way. It took me several days to get back to the road. Sleeping each night was a nightmare, although I never heard the footsteps again. I guess they knew I was going in the opposite direction and had no reason to try and scare me like they had been doing. I was still terrified though. I was still scared until I got back to the road. I was still scared hitchhiking back. I didn't stop being scared until I was safely in my own car and driving back home. I still hike and camp. Nowadays, though, I live in Colorado and hike in the mountains there.
This happened to me when I went camping with my boyfriend about 10 years ago. I was never really that much into camping, but it was one of his favorite things to do, so I agreed to go along. He told me he had a really nice spot that he'd like to camp out at, and it would take us a good day of hiking to get out to it. So, we packed up backpacks and our bags full of things, and we headed out. He hadn't been kidding about the good day of hiking. We started out before sunrise, and it was well into late afternoon by the time we got to where we had wanted to camp. I had to admit that it was a quite beautiful area. While my boyfriend was setting up the tent and the campground area, I told him that I would go gather up some firewood to make a fire with. I went off and had a little bit of trouble finding the wood at first. I had to search pretty far from the camp. I actually had gone so far away from the camp that I came across a small river or a large creek. I'm not really sure what it qualified as. As I got closer to the river, I noticed a pretty nasty looking man sitting on the bank with a matted dog. He just looked like what you would have expected a hermit to look like. He had a long beard and shaggy hair and was dressed in filthy rags for clothing. Although I decided it was best to try and avoid the hermit, he did catch notice of me. When he did, he got up and motioned for his dog to come over and follow him. I tried to pretend like I hadn't seen him, but that wouldn't deter the man. He called out to me, and I pretended not to hear him. That didn't deter him either. Eventually, he caught up to me, and I wasn't able to pretend like he wasn't there. The man seemed friendly enough, but he just creeps me out. It didn't make me any less nervous when I noticed that he had a big hunting knife sheathed on his boot, but he never made any attempt to reach for it. He began asking me questions like, what was a pretty little lady like me doing out in the wilderness by myself? I explained that I was not by myself, and that I was camping with my boyfriend, and I was just out looking for firewood. He didn't seem to believe me. The hermit kept looking at me as if he had just gotten out of prison, and I was the first person he had seen in decades. Hell, as far as I know, I was the first woman he had ever seen. He kept calling me a pretty little lady, and he wouldn't leave me alone, and it took a long time to eventually get away from him. When I did manage to leave him, he told me he would be keeping an eye out for me to make sure I was protected. He said he was sure that my boyfriend couldn't do the job on his own. When I got back to camp, I told all of this to my boyfriend. I wasn't really worried though. My boyfriend was a pretty big guy, and I was overly sure that he would be able to easily take care of the hermit if he showed up. So, we just concentrated on having a good time. Eventually though, we went into our tent and went to sleep. Really late at night, I was awoken by a noise. I immediately snapped to attention and listened. My mind immediately went back to the hermit, and when it definitely sounded like someone was creeping around outside, I woke my boyfriend up. I told him I heard something. As soon as the words were out of my mouth, he heard it too. My boyfriend snapped awake and looked around, telling me to lay low. He then crept out of the tent. This is where the worst part happened. He was gone for a really long time. Fortunately, the fire was still burning outside, so I could see him when he came back. But I got really worried because he must have gone so far from the tent, as he had been gone for a long time. It didn't make sense that he would stray so far away without telling me. And then I saw the shadow of a figure approach the tent. I could see it very clearly through the fabric, and it stood there. I prayed that it was my boyfriend, but I pretty much knew it wasn't. There was no way he would stand there like this shadow was, because he knew it would be scaring me. "Brad?" I croaked, my voice dry and timid.
"Nope, pretty little lady."
I heard the voice of the hermit respond to me, and it didn't sound as friendly as it had before. It sounded sinister, and it was more than enough to scare me to jump out of the door of the tent and run in the opposite direction for all I was worth. I very quickly ran into my boyfriend and told him what had happened. He kept me close as we made our way back to camp. By the time we had gotten there though, the hermit was gone, but our tent had been cut to shreds, obviously by the hunting knife that he had sheathed on his boot. I told Brad I wanted to leave, but it would have been dumb to travel in the dark. Instead, we stayed awake by the fire until dawn, packed up and left. I never went camping again.
Number 3. Puppets. I think I was 9 when this happened. You would think that such an impactful memory would ingrain itself into my brain a lot more solidly, that I would remember exactly when it had happened. But it was just one of those really scary things that I would have been happier to just forget. My dad and I liked to go camping all the time. He began taking me when I was younger, and I even had my own little pup tent. I loved it. It was small, but so was I, so it worked out just fine. My favorite thing about camping would be that, in lieu of ghost stories, my dad would actually do this little puppet show for me. We would put my tent to the side, so the side wall of it would be facing the fire, and he would do a little shadow puppet thing with his hands. It was really fun, and he was really good at it. The fact was that with a crackling fire behind him as he made the hand puppets, the images turned out to be really fun, and sometimes really, really creepy. Generally, by the time he was done, I would be completely tuckered out and fall right to sleep. So let us go ahead and assume I was 9 when this happened. I won't go into too much detail about the camping trip itself. It was just me and my father. My mom didn't really like camping, so she never went. We got out into the woods, we set up our tents and made the area up for the fire. We then went and did some fishing. We caught some nice fish, which my father then cooked for us over the fire. I always did love fish, and love it to this day, but no one can cook a fish as good as my father did. When it came close to time to go to bed, I was excited because that meant 2 things. My dad and I would make some s'mores, and then I would go into my tent with the s'mores while my dad told me a story using his scary hand puppets. Once I had a plate full of s'mores, I eagerly went into the tent with my s'mores. I got all nestled into my sleeping bag and ate my s'mores while I was watching my dad tell a few scary stories. He told the stories with both the hand puppets and words, and it was pretty cool. I actually dozed off though before the ending of the last story. I woke up later, not really in any way realizing how long I had been asleep, or even what time it was. I assumed I had only dozed off for a moment, and that my father hadn't even realized this because he was still making the hand puppets. I opened my eyes wide and sat up in my tent. Watching him, he wasn't actually telling me a story anymore though. He was making a hand puppet of a bunny rabbit and was just making it aimlessly hop around on the wall of the tent. I kept waiting for him to say something funny, like it was Bugs Bunny, or something scary, like it was a vicious killer rabbit or something. But he didn't say a word. He just kept making the bunny hop around in a circle. It would come closer to my tent, then go further away from my tent. And he kept this up over and over again. I was a bit confused, so I decided to open my tent and see if anything was wrong. The bunny had hopped close to my tent, so I unzipped it and opened up the flap and looked at my father, only to see that it was not my father outside of my tent. It was a strange man with a sick grin on his face, making bunny motions with his hands. He was looking right at me. He then stopped making the bunny movements and came over to the tent and grabbed me. I of course screamed loudly before the guy could get his hand up over my mouth. My father woke up right away and came out of the tent. He saw the guy struggling with me, had the wherewithal to grab the fish skillet, and he knocked the guy upside the head with it twice before the guy fell over. I was free. My dad wasn't done though. I can't tell you how many times he hit this man who was struggling to get to his feet. He eventually, though, managed to, and he ran off into the night. My dad decided it was best to just leave, rather than wait until morning. Fortunately, we hadn't parked that far away. We got all of our stuff, made it to the truck, and went home. That strange man ruined camping for me. For years, whenever we talked about going, I would see that scary face and remember being grabbed, and I would have to decline. Hey y'all, Killer Orange Cat here. If you like this video, please let me know by hitting the like button. If you're not already subscribed to Killer Orange Cat, please hit the button next to my furry buddy in order to be informed of new content. Please feel free to follow Ichigo and myself on Twitter and Facebook. Just keep in mind, I am a lot more responsive on those than Ichigo is. I'd like to thank the Grim Reader for collaborating with me. After you're done listening here, please head on to his channel to listen to the other half of the collaboration, and make sure to subscribe while you're there. I've included links to both his channel and the video on which I'm a guest narrator. I just also want to update you all as to what is happening next. I will be doing a creepypasta next. I've worked very hard to find a pasta that I haven't seen on anyone else's channel that I also think is really good. That will be up shortly. That'll be followed by my Waverly Hills video. That one is taking a lot of work, but I want it to be really good, so that's why I'm taking my time on it. I need it to fit within the narrative of the actual visit, and I'm sure you'll enjoy it once it's out. If you have a story you want to submit, my email address is included in the description. It could be a true story, and if you want to write a creepypasta for me, I'd be happy to read it as well. Thanks again to the Grim Reader for collaborating. And please, whatever you do, don't forget to make sure to check in your closet and check under your bed, because you never know where a killer orange cat might be hiding. Good night.